Fullerton on Your Money.
Hello there, I'm Ticky Fullerton. Every night bringing you a full hour of the very best in business coverage across the nation and internationally, especially where business and politics meet. Coming up, the I-Pace. Jaguar Land Rover's new electric vehicle with 100 million lines of coding is in Australia, and so is the global CEO, Dr. Ralf Speth. Our exclusive interview with the auto giant's chief on EVs, the real threats to the global auto business from Trump tariffs to Brexit, and the Jaguar Land Rover race challenge at the Invictus Games. A new low of 5% unemployment for Australia. So how does that play into the nation's economic outlook? And what should we be expecting from international pressures? Our interview with top economist and former RBA director Warwick McKibbin coming up. And a slide in sentiment weighing on Asian markets. We'll also get some analysis with Fidelity International's Yeung. Well, let's kick off, though, with the ivory tower in Canberra. First, federal politics, and all is not well within the National Party, it seems. Leader Michael McCormack says he has the full support of his party room, despite some of his colleagues privately agitating for a leadership spill. Could we really have another one? Privately, some National Party MPs are criticising their leader as being ineffective. But Mr McCormack has told Sky News no members have spoken to him about his leadership. A number of Nationals believe Barnaby Joyce could come back to the leadership to aid the party's re-election prospects. Well, Mr Joyce says he would be willing to take the leadership if it was offered, but his leader has downplayed those comments. Well, for the latest in the saga, Sky News political reporter Annalise Nielsen joins me live from Canberra. Boy, oh boy, Annalise, could we really see Barnaby Joyce back as leader of the National Party?
Well, what's another week in Canberra without another potential leadership spill? But it certainly is possible, and it is because we have been hearing for quite some time that there is disquiet within national ranks about the leadership of Michael McCormack. Now, we publicly today have seen every National MP come out in support of him and say that there's no move to remove him as leader, but we have heard for quite some time, and a number of MPs have been backgrounding journalists about the fact that they don't feel like Mr McCormack is having that cut through in the regions that the Nationals desperately need. He's already a bit on the outside being a Victorian. It's not the kind of usual stable platform that you'd have as the Nationals leader. Usually they come from the heartland of Queensland, and we understand that's where the disquiet really is coming from among the Queensland MPs. But Mr McCormack today said he doesn't think he has anything to worry about.
Sure, I appreciate that, and I support Barnaby in the role that he's doing as the member for New England. I support him in the role he's doing as a special drought envoy. And at the end of the day, people don't like us being focused on ourselves. They don't like this introspection. What they want us to do is represent them. That's what I'm doing, and that's what the National Party members are doing.
So people say maybe he's a little bit dull, Michael McCormack, but you talk about the Queensland support. I mean, what comes to mind, of course, is people like Matt Canavan and also David Littleproud, who was in himself thought of as possibility of an early leader too.
Oh, absolutely, and David Littleproud especially is seen as a real up-and-comer, but he's just a victim of the fact he's a first term, and that does seem like it is an issue within the party that they don't want someone too green taking the reins, and it is also a question of anyone who wants to take it. We know that with leadership spills, that generally the one who takes over doesn't fare the best either, but there's no way to really performance manage a leader out of a party in Canberra, or at least no one's thought of it yet. But Barnaby Joyce, he's certainly left the door open when he's been asked about it. He's said, of course, he'd like to be leader again, but he said that he wouldn't challenge for it, which kind of leaves it up to everyone else to put him back in the top seat. He was very cheeky when he was asked about it in question time today. Let's take a listen.
Understanding Order 99. I refer to the member's motion on the notice paper relating to the drought and the importance of providing strong leadership for rural and regional Australians. And I ask the member, when will the motion finally be put to a vote?
I must say that I'm completely overwhelmed. I know that you find me endearing. I know you miss me. I know you want me back. I know that I'm the only reason you ever get a question. I'm sure we will get to that motion, and when we do, and I'll take it on notice, I will get back to you personally. Or you might like to ask me another question. God knows I've got a bit of spare time up here.
Well, Annalise, look, I see the Telegraph, which had such a big part to play in his downfall. The Telegraph coming right back up and reminding everybody with a few of the key photos that were the sort of beginning of the end for Barnaby Joyce. But could he really be an election plus as leader of the National Party, do people think?
Well, those are always two very removed concepts in Canberra, between what they think is the best idea here in the building and then what they actually plays out in the electorate. And certainly he does still have a real branding problem with women. Women don't like the idea of a man who's had a family raised by his beautiful wife and then left her in the lurch, and so, but we do hear from a lot of people out in the real world that, especially men in regional areas, don't seem to have a problem with that and do like that he's a straight shooter, he's quite charming. And so you never know how it would play out in the electorate. But the issue, of course, for the Nationals is not who would be the best, but who would be better. And so they're looking at who they've got and who they would want to take to the next election. And there is any chance that a leadership spill within the Nationals wouldn't have the same traction in the community as ousting a Prime Minister. Generally, when you ask people outside of politics who the Deputy Prime Minister is, people have to take a minute to think about it, if they can think of it at all, because Michael McCormack certainly hasn't developed that profile like Barnaby Joyce. I was going to say,
they do now, but they didn't before with Barnaby Joyce. They knew exactly who the Deputy Prime Minister was. But speaking of dislodged Prime Ministers, I guess all eyes now are on this weekend and that Wentworth seat, and it's still looking pretty ropey for the government. They could shrink that 17% down to nothing.
Oh, absolutely. But you can tell there's a lot of nerves around it, and there's certainly no one who's confidently calling it either way. And that's really extraordinary when you've got a blue ribbon seat, a 17% margin. It's been held by the Liberals since the last time it was the electoral boundaries were drawn in the 40s. It really would be a huge blow to the government to lose it, not just because of the fact that they would lose it, but just with the effect that would have with them losing the majority in the House as well. So I think everyone's bracing themselves for what could happen this weekend. And with this leaked internal Liberal polling having Karen Phelps coming out ahead, it really is something that is causing quite a bit of concern. But we had, it was the former Prime Minister John Howard today warning people against that protest vote, saying that they'd just end up with a Labor government again. And in a seat like Wentworth, that's something that people really would take quite seriously.
All right, well, it'll all play out in due course. Annalise Nielsen, thank you very much for that. Right, now, we know how much of a splash that Prince Harry and Meghan have been making in Australia, quite literally. But remember back to that famous snap of them driving off after their wedding in that stunning sports Jaguar car. Well, it turns out that Jaguar Land Rover has built a pretty strong connection with the Duke of Sussex. The British-based global automaker has been a major sponsor for the Invictus Games ever since it was started by the Prince in 2014. No surprise, then, that global Jaguar Land Rover Chief Executive Dr. Ralf Speth flew into Sydney this morning for the Invictus Games, including a special challenge of his own. Dr. Speth also has a lot on his plate business-wise at the moment, starting with the massive disruption in the auto industry. Jaguar Land Rover this year joined the ranks of established automakers dipping their toes into the electric vehicle space, the company launching the I-Pace, a fully electric luxury SUV, the first European brand to challenge Elon Musk's Model S. Then there are other challenges, the Trump-China tariff wars, which are hitting the Chinese consumer market hard, new European regulations around diesel, of all things, and the clear and present danger, of course, of a hard Brexit. Dr. Ralf Speth's first engagement was at a British Chamber of Commerce lunch today, after which I sat down with him for an exclusive interview talking Invictus, electric vehicles, and how he's handling one of the toughest periods of transition in the auto industry's history. Dr. Speth, it's great to talk to you. Now, you're a very busy man. You're just off the plane from London, but you're out here for Invictus.
We are a representing partner in the Invictus Games in the very beginning, so for the 4th year now. And we are happy that we are really partnering up with Invictus, because from my point of view, it's absolutely important that we give the ex-serviceman woman a new opportunity to be integrated in society and to catch up.
In fact, Jaguar Land Rover has had a long history with defence, hasn't it?
We have indeed a long history with defence, but even so now with Invictus, we feel very, very obliged to help these people.
You've actually got the Jaguar Land Rover driving challenge as one of the Invictus Games now. Can you tell us a little bit about it and what the team has to do?
All nations, all parties are involved. And what they have to do is to drive a car with a precision, with speed, but also with a short circuit around the track in order to win the medal. And that needs a lot of skills, needs a lot of, let's say, also concrete ideas to win this game.
Now, you've actually got this beautiful car behind you, this I-Pace. It's an entirely electric vehicle. This is the future.
The future of modern mobility will indeed be electric. And the I-Pace is a start. And the I-Pace is the very first premium battery electric vehicle in the market. You can drive it today.
Electric vehicles around the world, they really haven't been adopted that fast. Now, why is that?
Electric vehicles are a totally new technology concept, and I-Pace, for instance, also uses the freedom of the new technology. But there are two elements. First of all, it's a price tag, it's the affordability. And battery electric vehicles are so much more expensive than normal comparable internal combustion engines.
When are they going to become affordable? I mean, really affordable, do you think?
They will be affordable when also the convenience, the second point, will be achieved. And convenience in the sense of a battery electric vehicle means that you have to have rapid charging opportunities around you, that the batteries can be reduced. And then it will be cheaper, and also the masses can afford then electric mobility.
I mean, this requires, presumably, government support, this sort of national infrastructure around the world, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. This means that government and industry across many sectors have really to work together to create this kind of infrastructure. Think about it. It's not only charging, it's the way and the speed you can charge. It's also the way how you can pay for the electricity you need. So there are so many things and there are many opportunities also to spin off smaller, fast growing industries.
Dr. Speth, have we got electric vehicles right? I ask that because there is this talk about dirty batteries, and that you can have an electric vehicle, a clean car, but if the energy that goes into making the battery is from, say, dirty coal, and indeed the electricity that goes into charging the batteries is also from high emission carbon energy, then, and a lot of this is not regulated around the world, then isn't this one step forward, two steps back?
You're totally right, and I start with the last statement out of your question. Governments really have also to play a role, and simultaneously, in order also to request from the automotive industry to deliver a certain percentage of battery electric vehicles, and there are targets for it. There are targets for NOx, there are targets for CO2, there are targets for emission levels. There are no targets for the infrastructure. Maybe, picking up your words, it would be a good idea also to define targets to set up the infrastructure with the right specification. On the other hand, the battery in itself is not dirty. It's a question how you fuel the battery. And if you want to have a clean air, then it's really necessary that we get renewable energies, water, sun, wind parks, to feed these kind of batteries.
And to make them, presumably.
To make them with a different approach, also to make them. But if you really calculate complete change and the ownership and the usage of the vehicle, then according to facts and figures, the battery electric vehicle is the best for the society and for the environment. There's no alternative today.
Dr. Speth, you've been in the auto industry for 30 years. You've grown Jaguar Land Rover. But right now, has there ever been a more challenging time in the industry, do you think?
You're absolutely right with your observation. At the very moment, the industry is really sees a lot of challenges. First of all, quite clear, as you mentioned, the technology challenges, from the internal combustion engine to battery electric vehicles, connected, autonomous cars. And on the one side, the car industry has at the moment to refine the battery electric vehicles and develop them, and also to refine simultaneously the internal combustion engines.
You're going ahead now with EVs and diesel and petrol, all three. Now, are you worried about this European regulation around diesel?
I'm very worried about the regulation on diesel because at the end of the day, a diesel engine is a very, very good engine. In terms of CO2, it's 20 to 30% better. And we have to think about CO2. It's important for our climate change.
The concern seems to be with other emissions.
On a NOx level, but also on an emissions level, on a particular level, in comparison to comparable internal combustion engine, the diesel is on the same level. So there's no reason not to buy the latest technology in diesels. So we will need diesel, and we should not only think about the passenger cars, we also have to think about commercial vehicles.
You've got what seems to be just cities banning diesel in Europe, is that right?
That's right, and wrong. It's wrong from a poor environmental point of view, as I mentioned, because it's only right if you take out of the complete equation the one isolated element, and that's not correct.
Another challenge at the moment is, of course, the Trump-China trade spat. Now, this is impacting industries at a lot of levels. Your sales were down in September. Now, one of the issues seems to be that Chinese customers who are looking to buy imported vehicles seem to be waiting to buy. Now, why is that?
Now, in China, we are faced at the moment with two elements. First of all, the waiting was the announcement of the Chinese government to reduce tariffs for imported cars. And secondly, we see also this kind of hesitation now in the market as a result of the argumentation in between China and the US concerning all this, concerning all the economical future.
So consumers just being reluctant to spend.
Yes, and by the way, that's not only about Jaguar Land Rover. That's the industry. That will also, each car company is facing these new developments here.
The other challenge, of course, is Brexit. Now, again, that is affecting, obviously, a lot of manufacturers, including Jaguar Land Rover. Now, I spoke to Lord Hague yesterday, and he told me he gives the chances of a Brexit deal going through and being approved by the British Parliament at just 50%. Now, that doesn't seem very high.
Now, Lord Hague is an expert, and he definitely knows these kind of details better than I do. But I rely that the politicians on both sides of the channel are going to find a solution for their own society, for the wealth of the society, but also to keep manufacturing and the industry alive.
I mean, you've been on the record as saying that if there's a hard Brexit, that tens of thousands of jobs could end up going.
Yes, that's correct. And by the way, everybody can do the math. That's very open and very transparent. And it's not only a Jaguar Land Rover, but it's also an element for the supplier industry and for all the export industry in the UK.
But would this really happen? I mean, I know companies like Airbus and BMW have said similar things, and also that there are reports that the British government has been meeting with the owner of Jaguar Land Rover, with Tata. Obviously, they're concerned. But just looking at the amount of skills and innovation that is sitting in that West Midlands area, I mean, surely that wouldn't pack up even with a hard Brexit, would it?
It will be very, very critical if we see a hard Brexit or no deal. Companies will disappear, plants will be closed. There is no way to survive a hard Brexit for many industries. But I hope, again, that the politicians see it and act for the benefit of their own population.
Yeah. Now, very interestingly, Tata, of course, who invested in Jaguar Land Rover back in 2008, you've now taken the decision to invest in a big factory in Slovakia, and I gather that is opening next week.
You're absolutely right. We are inaugurating our new plant in Slovakia, in Nitra, the city of Nitra, next week. And it's a fully fledged plant, so we can really produce in also Europe.
But it gives you a lot more flexibility of spreading your risks, that sort of stuff.
Absolutely, it gives us more flexibility, but I also want to mention that this decision has been made prior to any Brexit deal, because it takes a certain period of time with all the planning permission and setting up a factory, and it's not a result out of Brexit. No. And I even want to mention Jaguar Land Rover is a British company. We have our engineering, our heart in Britain, and we want to stay there, and we want to flourish, and we want to have more jobs in the automotive industry in Britain also.
So, looking out from your shareholders' point of view, how do you see the landscape over the next 12 months?
Overall, with the geopolitical challenges, but also with the internal challenges, Brexit, diesel and all this, it will be for the near future of the next, let's say, 1-2 years, very, very challenging to run the business.
And after that, you're hoping that these innovations take off?
Absolutely. So there must, if you are, let's say, at this kind of low point, better times will come, and we have wonderful brands, we have a wonderful product portfolio, and at the end of the day, these products will weather the storm.
Now, one of those products, of course, that some people have been waiting for a while now is the Land Rover Defender. Now, that line went down in 2016. There's a lot of anticipation. What can you tell us about it, Dr. Speth?
I only can tell you that it was one of my saddest moments running the company, to have to stop the production of the Defender. Defender is a wonderful, capable car. And you can be assured that the team which has built Defender for 70 years has done nothing else than just developed very, very capable SUVs, creating the luxury SUV with a Range Rover. They know exactly what to do. And they also dream of the most capable car of the future.
Right, well, I think some of them are around under a bit of khaki at the moment, but we can look forward to seeing them maybe in 2019?
We make the most capable car, therefore it takes time.
OK. Dr. Speth, it's been a delight to talk to you. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.
I've been trying to interview him for about 5 years, so it was great to talk to Dr. Speth. After the break, a huge jobs beat. But is it all sunshine and roses ahead for the economy? Former RBA board member Warwick McKibbin next.
You're watching Ticky on Your Money. Now, back to Ticky.
Yes, welcome back. Well, a big beat on jobs data for September, falling to lowest levels since 2012. The headline unemployment rate dropping sharply to 5% for the month, seasonally adjusted, with the participation rate also dropping by 0.3% to 65.4. The improvement driven by solid employment increases in Victoria, Western Australia and New South Wales, with 20,000 new full-time jobs added overall. NAB senior economist David De Garis telling Your Money a drop in the rate was expected, but the size of the fall was surprising.
The trend has been for some fall in the unemployment rate for a period of time now. So we understand the employment story, that the trend there has been positive. Most of the top line indicators on labour demand still suggest that labour demand is on the up. Businesses are trying to recruit. So I think the trend is pretty clear, but 0.3 in 1 month, obviously you can't extrapolate anything approaching that.
So what do these rosy numbers show about the outlook? Well, the Reserve Bank's October minutes yesterday said progress on unemployment and inflation is likely to be gradual, with no strong case for an adjustment to monetary policy in the near term. Well, that's contrary to comments from Warwick McKibbin as to what should be done, the former RBA board member and professor at the ANU's Crawford School. He argues the RBA should have lifted rates maybe 12 months ago. He says the central bank should expect more and larger economic shocks. Well, Professor Warwick McKibbin joins us live from our Canberra studio. studio. Warwick, great to see you there. What do you make of these rather rosy-looking jobs numbers today?
Hi, Ticky. Well, they're continuing a trend. I think there's a lot of volatility in that series, so I don't think you can extrapolate the scale. But the economy is travelling along quite well. We have low inflation. We have strong job growth.
Anything that worries you in the economy at the moment?
What worries me mostly is outside the economy. What's happening in the US, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in trade policy generally. There's a lot of things happening that have impacts on Australia, but Australia so far is cruising along.
Well, just unpack a couple of those things for me, Warwick, because, I mean, obviously you spend a lot of time in the US. How do you read the Fed, first of all? Because I was speaking this week, actually, to Citigroup's Ebrahim Rabari. Now, he says he thought that everybody, the market taking Jerome Powell's recent comments far too literally, and that he's much more dovish on the Fed. Is that, would you agree with that or not?
Well, not really. I think Powell is just following in the footsteps of Janet Yellen, and that is to announce a fairly credible path of interest rate increases. This is even before the Trump fiscal stimulus. He had an upward path of interest rates. The Fed has now got to react as well to a massive increase in the US budget deficit, 5% of GDP, a rising debt in the US from the government, and that's going to put at least 100 to 150 basis points into real interest rates at the long end of the curve. And so the Fed now has to deal with a fiscal stimulus in a full employment economy and start to unwind their own balance sheet. So it put them in an awkward position. The biggest problem, I think, is actually the president attacking the Fed for being ridiculous. It's not. It's actually doing what it should be doing, and the president is really endangering the financial health of the US economy.
Yeah, you think by his comments he is putting direct pressure on the Fed? Do you think they'll resist it, or how would you respond if you were Jerome Powell?
Oh, well, actually, I know how I'd respond. It'd even make me more willing to stick to my original plan, because you don't want to be seen to be doing what the president's telling you to do if you're an independent central banker.
Yeah, no, well, exactly. So what do you make of the wobbles over the last 2 weeks or so on the markets at the moment in Wall Street?
Well, again, if you do any calculation of what's the true value of the US stock market under a rising interest rate world, it's got to be lower than it is today. There's a lot of excess valuation in that market. I mean, there's a small probability that, in fact, there's an enormous amount of wealth about to be generated by new technology, but my guess is that the market is pricing in the wrong interest rate profiles when they're calculating expected future dividends. And so I think that market has to adjust, particularly with the fiscal stimulus that's been pushed into that economy. Our own modelling says that the market could go up at least 10%, but then it drops quite sharply over subsequent years. So we're at a period where the stimulus is being positive, but by next year it'll be starting to be coming off, and the year after that we'll be pretty surprised, I think, at just how weak some of the US numbers might be. And they're overdue for a recession, and this stimulus has just postponed that by several years.
Yeah, aren't we all? So if the Fed continues on, marches on with these interest rates, and our Reserve Bank here seems to be sitting on his hands on that score, does that leave us exposed?
Well, you can see the argument why the Reserve Bank is happy to sit where interest rates are sitting at the moment, because the economy seems to be running well. The issue I have is that if you look at the real rate of interest in the Australian economy, which is the money rate minus inflation, it's actually negative. And we're in an economy that's growing strongly with a negative interest rate. There isn't much downside left in interest rates. 1.5% is a low rate. If we raised interest rates for 25 basis points with a clear framework as to why we're doing it, and that is because we want capital to be allocated in the economy based on the true value of capital and not having excess speculation because of low interest rates. A 25 basis point increase in interest rates shouldn't cause any problems. If it does, then you should have done it a year ago. My guess is it would actually reset a lot of people's expectations about where the economy is heading and the value of speculation, and people would pull back. Now they're already pulling back. So they're pulling back because of tightening credit conditions. They're pulling back because housing prices are starting to fall. That just makes it that much harder for the Reserve Bank to raise interest rates to a more normal level when they need to. And so I think it puts them into a corner which is probably not a good place to be given what's happening in the rest of the world.
And the RBA very, very focused on the lack of wage growth.
Absolutely. So yeah, their inflation mandate, they're well within their inflation mandate, and if you worry about inflation, then what you worry about is what's happening to wages, and wages aren't growing, so there won't be much inflation. That's not really the biggest problem Australia faces. I think what we need in this economy is nominal income growth. There's a lot of debt in the system. You want nominal growth in the economy so that your debt to income ratios don't spiral out of control. And by focusing just on inflation, looking at asset markets and other markets that Phil Lowe wrote about when he was at BIS, I think that there is an argument for raising rates gradually over time with a clear explanation of why you're doing it.
Warwick, you've spent so much time as well looking at energy and emissions. I just wonder whether you've had half an eye on the last week of talk around energy. We've got the chair of the Energy Security Board, Kerry Schott, coming out and saying the landscape's anarchy out there, and clearly the grid's stability is questionable with all these this renewable being pumped in, and questions about hollowing out of business models of traditional power. How do you see that, and indeed this new reliability mechanism by the new energy minister coming in, and a possibility that industry might look at some sort of emissions target?
Well, it's total chaos, and I think if we go back over the last 10 to 15 years, there are many, many better ways you could do the policy framework for both the climate issue and the energy issue. And we're just currently doing a big study for the Brookings Institution looking at the Paris Agreement and what it means for the major countries, including Australia. And we were asked if we could model the actual policies. We know what the targets are, but we just don't know what the policies are, and that's true across most countries. So it's a challenge to try and get your head around it. But it's a real problem. The US not being part of the Paris, or announcing withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, creates uncertainty. Australia not having a framework either in the energy or the climate space creates enormous uncertainty, and that discourages investment. And discouraging investment means that you don't have the capacity online when you need it. And it needs a really clear bipartisan agreement. It has to be bipartisan, because without that, no clever, fancy spin policy will actually make a difference. It has to be a real policy, and some winners and some losers will come out of it, but at least that gives you a framework to proceed and to move forward. Yeah,
so briefly, this idea of industry trying to cobble together some sort of emissions target on the side to make the other half of the reliability side, that's not going to work, in your view?
Well, but the problem, Ticky, is not just what's happening in electricity generation. That's about a third of our emissions. We've got to worry about what's happening to the emissions right across the economy.
Yeah, so beyond the NEM.
The Paris Agreement, you've got to worry about agriculture, you've got to worry about a whole range of other activities, and you have to worry about the lack of reliable energy. So these two problems are interrelated, but they also have very large parts which are separate, and it doesn't come down to how we produce electricity. It's much more complicated than that. And even an agreement amongst some firms or some energy generators isn't going to be the broad framework that you need to mobilise the capital that's going to be required to restructure the Australian economy to deal with a low emissions world, which is inevitably going to have to happen.
All right. You'll come back and talk about it once you've done your Brookings report?
December it should be out, but we're having some difficulties trying to work out what the policies are, so it's hard to model vapour.
All right, that's terrific. Well, Warwick McKibbin, thank you so much for joining us. Great to talk.
Thanks very much, Ticky.
Now, after the break, a slide in investor sentiment putting pressure on Asian markets. For more with Fidelity International's Catherine Yeung.
This is Ticky on Your Money, covering the big business stories.
Yes, welcome back. The US Trade Representative's Office says it intends to open trade talks with the European Union, the United Kingdom and Japan. It comes as Chinese exporters say they're increasingly worried about the collateral damage the current trade war may have on the global economy.
In recent months, the US has renegotiated NAFTA and started a trade war with China. But that, it seems, isn't enough. The US Trade Representative Office has told Congress it intends to open talks with the EU, Japan and the UK.
Well, I don't think this should come as any much of a surprise to many people. I think that considering that it pretty much plays perfectly into the Trump playbook on international trade, giving these bilateral trade negotiations.
Japan's $69 billion goods deficit is an obvious target, although that's dwarfed by the $150 billion plus deficit the US has with the European Union. For the UK, it's a boost for those looking forward to life outside the EU, although China's exclusion is a worry.
That doesn't bode especially well, because obviously that sort of pretty much continues this trade dispute that we've got, that continues to escalate towards an all-out trade war, with the US and China being the two largest economies in the world, and that's not going to be especially good for global growth going forward.
Chinese exporters have been showing off their wares at the country's largest trade fair. A poll of 91 of them suggests almost two-thirds are worried about the impact of the trade war.
Overall, there are fewer buyers here this year than previous years. It's because of the trade war. There's no doubt about that.
Around half of the firms wanted China to hold talks with the US to resolve the crisis, but only a quarter see orders falling this year. Rising costs within China are also a problem, as are tightening regulations and the strength of the dollar. That's making customers in emerging markets less able to buy Chinese products.
Well, those trade tensions, plus surging oil prices and a surging US dollar, have been weighing on Asian equity markets. For more details, let's bring in Catherine Yeung, Investment Director at Fidelity International, joins us live from Hong Kong. Catherine, hello there. I haven't spoken to you for a few weeks. How is the market feeling about the sort of correction on Wall Street, first of all?
So we are in this risk-off environment in terms of investors, but you could also argue that given where multiples and where the market's trading, a lot of the risks are now priced in. What is interesting though, Ticky, is that the Japanese released their export data today and it was down. So the first time we saw a decline since November 2016, just highlighting that it's not just an issue between the Americans and the Chinese, but the entire supply chain when it does come to Asian exports to the US.
Right, OK. It was interesting. I was speaking to the global head of Jaguar Land Rover just now, and it's quite clear that, bizarrely, his sales were down last month, but that was because China's tariffs are about to go down, and so customers, in terms of buying them from, say, Europe and Britain, so customers are actually waiting. I mean, this really is altering business behaviour, isn't it?
It is indeed. And what's interesting is, you know, on a recent trip we did do into China, when you look at the upgrading of goods, and so, you know, consumers really climbing up the value chain or climbing up the J curve, what's interesting is we look at auto sales in China, they're up about 1% year on year. But if you're certain brands, i.e. BMW or Mercedes, your sales are up 12, 16%. So it's all about brand power in this kind of market. And the domestic drivers are still very much intact, albeit softer data versus last year.
Right, OK. Now, what else is actually factoring into the market at the moment? I'm thinking about things like oil prices.
Well, if we do see this full-on escalation of trade war, so to speak, coupled with higher oil prices, this all feeds through into higher global inflation, and that is something that investors are very much focusing on. But in terms of, if we just look at the Chinese names in particular, concerns about a weaker macro environment. I mentioned the softer data that's come through this year versus last year. That's weighing on even tech names because of advertising potential for next year.
Right, OK. So literally going out now, you're looking at sort of stocks in China. What sort of companies would you look at?
Well, it's across the board, but what's quite interesting at this moment, given the volatility we're seeing in price action, are what we call fallen angels. So these names who are seeing indiscriminate selling off, yet their earnings still look attractive. So, for example, you know, again, not that we try and time the market, but certain names, given their multiples, but they're compounding good earners, long-term good earners, they're the kind of names we have been focusing on.
Yeah, so between now and Christmas, you still see a bit of a rocky ride, do you?
A bit of a rocky ride, but considering that the Chinese market really has been one of the worst performers year to date, we do expect a technical rebound. It's also worth noting, Ticky, that there's something in China called the national team, and this is part of the government. And for example, in the previous A-share or mainland Chinese correction that we saw a few years ago, it's quite often that the national team will come in and support the market, i.e. they buy stocks. They've been very, very absent this time around. So again, because we're probably going to see a natural low at some point, you could see some value hunters really emerge, and this will lead to a subsequent bounce.
Yeah, and with these trade wars and with Brexit and various other nervousnesses, still the emerging markets are struggling, one would think.
Yes, but in fact, a lot of clients globally, a lot of investors, some commentators, if you read a lot of the reports and the research coming through now, they are saying because of where valuations are, and again, the markets have fallen quite a lot, this could be, at some point, a rotation indicator back from developed markets into emerging markets. So again, this could be happening, or this could happen despite the volatility that we have been experiencing.
All right, Catherine Yeung, that's really interesting. Thanks very much for the view from Hong Kong there. Well, moving to international news now, and the United States is demanding access to a recording said to have been made when missing journalist Jamal Khashoggi was being killed inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Senior sources in Turkey have told Sky News that the recording suggests he was tortured, drugged and then dismembered. Turkish police have since left the Consul General's home after spending hours inside the residence searching for more evidence.
The Saudi investigators arrived at the Consul General's house ahead of the Turkish team. Their leaders have promised a full inquiry, rapid and timely.
Can you tell us any more about the disappearance of Jamal?
But so far there's been stony silence or blanket denials. What happened behind these gates, inside these walls, technically on Saudi sovereign territory, has seriously disturbed the global community, and the Saudis show no obvious signs of appearing to be more open. 4 van loads of Turkish police and forensic investigators armed with box loads of kit will examine the home of Saudi's top diplomat in Turkey. Among the equipment, gas masks. They're expected to spray chemicals which will show up any tiny specks of blood which might be there. One very well-placed source told us they'll be examining whether corrosive chemicals were used to dispose of body parts.
They have got with them gas masks and cameras, some very sophisticated equipment there. They're determined to go not only into the garden, but also every single room of the Consul General's house to find out exactly what happened and how the remains of the body were disposed of.
This was where the investigators believed the body was brought to. One Turkish source told us an audio recording captures the journalist being beaten shortly after entering the consulate just after 1 o'clock on October the 2nd. It's here they say he was drugged, killed and dismembered. The Turkish claim the Saudi hit squad then drove the short distance to the Consul General's home, where they tried to get rid of his remains, and they're investigating if acid was used. It was into this febrile atmosphere that the US Secretary of State arrived in Ankara. As the Saudis' main ally, and with the American president so far their chief defender, he has a difficult job convincing the Turkish government that the truth will out. Turkey has so far carefully managed the continuous drip of damning information about what happened to the journalist, leaking lurid details through both Turkish and international media. But it's down to the forensic teams now to come up with some tangible and irrefutable evidence. Alex Crawford, Sky News, Istanbul.
Well, after the break, 10 years of the deal. Talking the best deals in Australian business with the Australian's Helen Trinca next.
Now, back to Ticky.
Yes, welcome back. Well, due out tomorrow, the 10th birthday issue of the Australian's business magazine, The Deal. Inside, you'll find an array of the magazine's top profiles, including one-on-ones with Frank Lowy, Alan Joyce, James Packer and Paula Dwyer. Here to talk the biggest business deals in Australian history is Helen Trinca, who's editor of The Deal and a Sydney managing editor of The Australian. She joins me live from Canberra. Helen, this is what a cover, first of all. I think we might have a screenshot of that cover. Isn't it magnificent with these caricatures of some of our biggest businessmen?
Indeed it is, and good afternoon, Ticky. What's wonderful about those cartoons, of course, is those illustrations have been done by Johannes Leek, and Johannes is the son of Bill Leek, of course, who is the former Bill Leek, the late Bill Leek, who was one of our, stars of the Australian. And Johannes is following in his footsteps as a wonderful illustrator. We asked him to illustrate for the 10 top interviews we did, including obviously with Frank Lowy, who is, you've got to say, probably the supreme deal maker in Australian recent history, I would think.
Well, of course, his deal, the sale of his business that he built to Unibail-Rodamco, that's #1 on your big deal list, isn't it?
It is. And I just want to credit, first of all, Bridget Carter, who pulled together that list, and she's a business reporter with us, of course, at The Australian. And yes, it was a fantastic deal. I think Frank himself refers to it in the magazine in another section as the deal of the century, the deal of the 21st century, and it probably is. It was a fabulous deal. And as everyone says, and as Bridget also says in her piece, it's impeccable timing. You know, there's a lot of headwinds happening around retailers and, shopping centres because of online shopping and all the changes in retail. But you have to hand it to Frank and to the whole Lowy family, really, in managing to execute a fabulous deal back, late December, January.
Indeed, I love the way that Bridget also puts in who the advisors are, which of course is such an important side of M&A, and has driven so many of these deals. Tell me, what are a couple of the other interviews that you really liked?
Loved, yes. Well, I mean, what I loved in the magazine too was the opportunity to ask people like Frank and other, leaders about the art of the deal. And so what Frank says, which is terribly interesting, I think, is he says that deals are good for the soul and they're great fun. And I've always thought, observing, Frank Lowy from a distance, is he must be one of the most charming people, you could ever really meet. And I think that charm has to be an amazingly important element of actually doing deals. I mean, everyone obviously knows it's about the numbers and about whole lots of other, very technical factors, but I think what comes through in all of our interviews with senior people, including Alan Joyce, is the importance of the relationship. And I think that's something which you can see when everything else is, sort of almost at the point of convergence, the capacity for one or other of the parties to sort of be able to convince the other side that they're going to win, and everybody's going to win something, somebody's going to lose something, but everybody's a winner. It's got to be a win-win, as Frank Lowy says.
Well, as you say, the art of the deal, but of course that is what the US president has always lived by. And you mentioned that Frank Lowy really obviously enjoys the deal. It seemed to me that probably the president does as well.
Yes, I think, and in fact Cameron Stewart has done a piece for us actually on Donald J. Trump and his capacity for deal making. And, he says, this is what I do. He quotes him, I'm good at this, this is what I do. And we know that he certainly is good at marketing his capacity to do deals. And what's fascinating, of course, is that, look, he's not completely wrong in what he says, what he says about it, that he can feel it. Trump says, I think, and has said on occasion, that I know if it's going to work because I can feel it. And I actually tend to think, that probably the best of our business people and the best of those who absolutely love a deal and know how to get something difficult through have got that capacity. It's not cut and dried. It's not it's not black and white. There's a huge amounts of uncertainty, I suppose, in deals, and the need to have the conviction. And if you're convinced, you might be able to convince the buyer.
Gut thinking.
And it's a lot about.
Look, another couple of deals that you've got there. Well, let's go through your top three. Now, Macquarie's sale of Dyno Nobel, that was back in 2008, but it was a massive buy and then a massive sell. They made, over $1 billion out of it, didn't they?
Yeah, exactly. I think they nearly doubled their price. I mean, it sold, I think it was a $3.2 billion deal, and they'd basically bought it 3 years earlier for about $1.7 billion. And it's really extraordinary. And they don't call them the Millionaire's Factory. They don't call Macquarie the Millionaire's Factory for nothing, Ticky, I suppose. But you can just see that sort of chutzpah as well, can't you? I mean, that comes in as #2 on our list, and then. Bridget's chosen sort of as #3 the Transurban Group, the big operator of toll roads in Australia.
I think that's a very good choice.
She says it's very hard to pick.
Yeah, that was such a cool deal. Look, it had all sorts of warts hanging off it in various different directions, but at its heart, remember BrisConnect's everything. This is Transurban's acquisition of Queensland's motorways. But a very clever deal. Yeah.
And she makes a point too that they're good at deals and they've made quite a few good ones, but that's probably the standout. And yes, it was fascinating for her to go back on the 10 best, and of course Andrew White, also in the magazine, has chosen the 10 worst, which we won't necessarily go into in detail right now, Ticky, but what's fascinating, of course, is to look at how the good and the bad. And one of the points that they both made to me when they were writing this was that someone's great deal is someone else's bad deal, you know. And
well, exactly.
One of the examples that
well, exactly. Go on. Now, give us an example.
Yeah. Well, the one I think that does come to mind is the Japan Post buying into purchase of toll holdings, and of course, and then so toll came out of that fabulously, but it was, I think there's a big write down later on from of it by Japan Post, you know, not sort of too much longer later, but I think that. You recall that deal yourself, of course. It was an interesting show. They had a winner and a loser.
A winner and a loser all at a time when there was a lot of disruption to it as well. And look, just going through a couple of these other ones, of course, Slater and Gordon's buying out of Quindell. And do you remember that? The classic, the class action merchants that led to their own class action. Yes, yeah, I know, that's right. So there have been some doozies, I suppose, is what you can say. And of course, earlier on, I suppose the big mining, the big resource companies, you know, sort of their. Look, I suppose the bigger the organisation, sometimes the bigger the ambition of the deal, and then sometimes the harder the fall. But briefly, and the other one, of course, it comes. I was going to say, just quickly before you go, Sally Lone at the Financial Services Commission, she has come out on record for the first time since that interview with in front of the Royal Commission. Yes, indeed, and she was at a. The deal had a panel discussion yesterday with, we invite girls, Year 12 girls, to come in every year and listen to a panel of CEOs. And Sally was on the panel, and we asked her, obviously, how you sort of got back in the saddle after you do come a cropper, which was really, she did have a very bad day at the Royal Commission. And she basically was quite firm in her statement that, you know, she'd never considered resigning, and that she is very much you know, forging ahead, I suppose, and arguing strongly that that she will continue. Yeah, well, good on her. All right, thank you very much. I shall enjoy reading that. That's absolutely super. Well done. Good. Thank you. Bye-bye. All the best. Well, that's all for the show tonight. Tomorrow night, Head of Asia Pacific Financial Markets Research at Rabobank, Michael Every. Until then, thanks for your company.